What if the people you trusted most, your own family, held a darkness you could never imagine? What if a warning from your closest friend was dismissed, ignored, or worse, misunderstood? This is not a hypothetical scenario. This is the tragic, shocking, and utterly unreal story of Rob Reiner, Hollywood legend, and the last warnings that might have saved him and his beloved wife, Michelle. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. It all begins with a private conversation. Picture a quiet afternoon in Los Angeles, the sun casting long shadows over manicured lawns and the opulent facade of the Brentwood estate. Rob Reiner, 78, a man whose name evokes laughter, storytelling, and cinematic brilliance, is speaking on the phone with Billy Crystal, his lifelong friend. Their friendship is legendary, stretching across decades of Hollywood glitz and turmoil, of jokes exchanged on late-night sets, of confidences shared during life's toughest moments. But this call wasn't about scripts, premieres, or comedy routines. No, this conversation was darker, more urgent. Billy's voice carried a weight that made Rob pause. Billy warned him, in a tone rarely used even between best friends, "Rob, watch your back. Your son has a dark obsession with you." Imagine hearing that. Imagine the disbelief, the confusion, the instinct to dismiss it as overcaution or exaggeration. But Billy was not a man given to dramatics. He had known Rob since their earliest days, understood him in ways no one else did. And yet, even that bond, even that trust, could not make the warning any less terrifying. At the time, it may have seemed like an uncomfortable moment, a fleeting concern. But as we now know, it was the prelude to something unimaginable. Rob Reiner and Michelle, 70, were discovered brutally stabbed to death in their $13.5 million Brentwood estate, a place that had once been a sanctuary of family, laughter, and love. The estate itself seemed untouched, almost serene from the outside. But inside, it had become the stage for a horror that no one could have predicted. The couple's son, Nick, 32, who lived in the guest house on the property, was arrested that very night, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The shockwaves rippled through Hollywood and the world. How could this happen in one of the most privileged, ostensibly safe neighborhoods in Los Angeles? How could a son, someone loved, nurtured, and protected, commit such a heinous act against his own parents? To understand the tragedy, to truly grasp how warning signs, unheeded advice, and dark obsessions culminated in the worst possible outcome, we need to go back. We need to explore not just the crime itself, but the intricate web of relationships, warnings, and overlooked signals that led to that fateful day. Because the story is far more complex than a simple headline suggests. This is not just about a murder. This is about family, obsession, trust, betrayal, and the devastating consequences of ignoring the signs right in front of you. Billy Crystal's warning is a thread that runs through this story like a red line of tension. It was not idle speculation. It was based on years of observing behavior, of noticing patterns that most outsiders would dismiss. Yet, in a tragic twist of fate, even the people closest to the danger, the people who could have acted, either couldn't fully comprehend the risk or chose to rationalize it away. That hesitation, that disbelief, became part of the tragic calculus. Now, before we dive deeper, let's pause and ask, what would you do if someone warned you about someone you love most in the world? Would you act immediately, or would you tell yourself it's impossible, that your trust can never be betrayed in such a horrific way? That question is not rhetorical. It is the crux of the story we are about to unfold. We also need to understand the setting, Brentwood, Los Angeles. It is a neighborhood synonymous with wealth, privilege, and prestige. Celebrities, executives, and creatives call it home, drawn by its promise of safety, security, and exclusivity. The Reiner estate, valued at $13.5 million, was more than just a home. It was a reflection of a life well lived, a career marked by creativity and achievement, and a family's personal sanctuary. To the outside world, it seemed untouchable. But darkness has a way of creeping into the places we least expect. Sometimes, the greatest danger lies not in the world outside, but in the shadows within. Nick Reiner's presence on the property, living in the guest house, seemed ordinary. Parents providing a space for their adult child is commonplace. But what happened behind closed doors in that guest house, the behaviors, obsessions, and the slow unraveling of sanity, is what sets this case apart. Friends, neighbors, and acquaintances had noticed peculiarities. Moments of tension, erratic behavior, late-night disturbances, but nothing prepared anyone for the ultimate act of violence that would shock the world. And yet, even as the public reels from the immediate horror, we must also confront the hidden layers of the story. This is where Billy Crystal's warning becomes crucial. He saw patterns, behaviors, and a psychological undercurrent that others missed. He wasn't just concerned, he was afraid. And that fear, tragically, was prophetic. In private, he tried to impress upon Rob the gravity of the situation, but as often happens in families, the uncomfortable truth was difficult to confront. No parent wants to believe that their child could harbor deadly intentions. No friend wants to believe that a warning they offer could go unheeded with fatal consequences. This story also forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about trust, perception, and the nature of obsession. How does someone develop a fixation so intense that it leads to violence against those closest to them? How often are warning signs dismissed simply because they are inconvenient, shocking, or impossible to reconcile with our understanding of the people we love? And most importantly, could this tragedy have been prevented? These are not abstract questions. They are the very questions that hover over every detail of the Reiner case. As we explore the timeline, the family dynamics, and the critical warnings that were ignored, you will begin to see a pattern emerge. There are moments that, in hindsight, seem obvious, incidents that scream danger but were minimized or rationalized. There are conversations, warnings, and signs that, had they been acted upon, might have changed everything. And there are secrets, dark obsessions, and psychological patterns that, once fully revealed, will shock even the most seasoned true crime observers. For now, consider this. In the days, weeks, and months leading up to the tragedy, the Reiners lived their lives much like any other successful, loving family. Rob continued his creative work, Michelle engaged with friends and family, and Nick moved through his days in the guest house. To an outsider, it appeared normal, even idyllic. But beneath the surface, tension simmered, and behind that tension, the shadow of obsession grew. Billy Crystal, attuned to human behavior in ways few could be, recognized it, and tried, desperately, to intervene. As the introduction to this story, the stage is set. We have the central figures, the warnings, and the tragedy that looms like a dark storm on the horizon. You now know the outcome in broad strokes, but what you do not know are the hidden details, the small incidents that escalated into horror, and the chilling foresight of Billy Crystal's warning. Those details will reveal the complexity of human behavior, the fragility of trust, and the devastating consequences of ignoring what should never be ignored. So, as we begin this journey, ask yourself, what would you do if someone you trusted implicitly warned you about a danger you could barely imagine? How would you reconcile love with fear, trust with suspicion? And what could drive a person to commit the unthinkable against their own family? What makes a life truly legendary? Is it the work you leave behind, the accolades, the laughter and joy you've shared with the world? Or is it the family you build, the people who know your heart when no one else does? For Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner, it was both. They were Hollywood royalty in their own right. But more than that, they were devoted parents, friends, and pillars of a community that admired them for decades. Yet, beneath the glittering surface of fame, wealth, and public adoration, a storm was quietly forming, a storm that would ultimately shatter the life they had so carefully built. Rob Reiner's journey to legendary status is well documented. He began as an actor, the boyish charm of Meathead in All in the Family, endearing him to millions. He transitioned seamlessly into directing, delivering cinematic triumphs like This Is Spinal Tap, The Princess Bride, and When Harry Met Sally. Each film showcased not only his talent, but his deep understanding of human relationships, the humor, the heartbreak, the subtle ironies of life. To the world, Rob was a creator, a storyteller, a man who understood the human heart. To those who knew him intimately, he was also kind, generous, and deeply loyal. Michelle Reiner, though less publicly known, was equally remarkable. She brought stability, warmth, and grace to the family, complementing Rob's larger-than-life personality. Friends describe her as intuitive, fiercely protective of her children, and endlessly compassionate. Together, Rob and Michelle embodied a vision of Hollywood family life that seemed almost unreal. A golden couple who had achieved the dream, balancing career, fame, and love. Their son Nick, however, would complicate that story. Like many children of high-profile parents, Nick lived in the shadow of his father's success. He had the privilege of wealth, access to opportunities, and the kind of social connections most people only dream of. But with privilege can come pressure, entitlement, and a host of unresolved psychological challenges. Nick's behavior, often erratic and obsessive, would eventually clash catastrophically with the world his parents worked so hard to maintain. The Brentwood estate itself was a reflection of their lives, a sprawling, immaculate home nestled in one of Los Angeles's most exclusive neighborhoods. From the outside, it projected safety, security, and the promise of a perfect family life. The lawns were meticulously kept, the interiors adorned with personal mementos and art, each corner a testament to decades of careful living and creative accomplishment. It was, in many ways, a sanctuary. But even the most beautiful sanctuaries can hide secrets. And sometimes, the most dangerous threats come not from the outside world, but from those you trust the most. Friends and colleagues often remarked on Rob's warmth and Michelle's kindness. Hollywood is known for its cutthroat culture, but the Reiners were different. They were approachable, genuine, and deeply connected to their community. Their parties, gatherings, and collaborations brought together some of the most influential figures in entertainment, yet they remained grounded, never letting fame overshadow family. This duality, public success and private devotion, made their lives appear enviable, almost untouchable. But untouchable is an illusion. And in the case of the Reiners, that illusion would be shattered in the most shocking way possible. To understand the gravity of what happened, we need to look closely at the family dynamic. Rob and Michelle were not just parents. They were protectors, mediators, and guides. They sought to nurture Nick, providing him with opportunities while attempting to manage his erratic tendencies. Friends and family members would later describe countless incidents where Rob tried to guide his son gently, to redirect obsessive or troubling behaviors, and to maintain a delicate balance between support and discipline. Yet, the more they tried to maintain stability, the more tensions seemed to grow. Small incidents that might have been brushed off in another family became symptoms of a deeper, more dangerous pattern. There were whispers of anger, unexplained aggression, and behavior that unsettled friends and neighbors alike. And through it all, Rob and Michelle did what they could to shield the public from the inner turmoil of their family life. They continued to work, to host, to live life fully, projecting normalcy even as cracks began to form behind the walls of their estate. Billy Crystal, Rob's longtime friend, was not oblivious to these tensions. Over decades of friendship, he had become attuned to Rob's world, both public and private. He noticed the subtle shifts in Nick's behavior long before anyone else. But warnings, even from the most trusted friend, are often difficult to act upon when they involve family. It is one thing to recognize danger in a stranger. It is another to confront it within the walls of your own home. And yet, Billy's concerns were not fleeting. He repeatedly observed patterns that suggested more than typical teenage rebellion or adult immaturity. He saw obsession, fixation, and behaviors that hinted at potential danger. He tried to communicate these observations to Rob, often in private, with the urgency of someone who had seen warning signs ignored one too many times. Rob, however, like many loving parents, struggled to reconcile the warnings with the child he knew and loved. Denial is a powerful force, and in family dynamics, it can be fatal. As we recount the Reiner legacy, it is essential to balance admiration for their accomplishments with an understanding of the vulnerabilities that lay beneath the surface. Rob Reiner's brilliance as a director, Michelle's steadfast presence as a mother and partner, and the seemingly idyllic life they built all contrast sharply with the tragedy that awaited them. This juxtaposition, success and horror, love and betrayal, is central to understanding the story. It is what makes the events that followed so difficult to comprehend and so compelling to explore. Imagine walking through their home in the days before the tragedy. Family photos on the walls, trophies and awards in the living spaces, rooms filled with warmth, laughter, and history. And yet, somewhere behind one of the guest house doors, a darkness was growing, one that would eventually erupt with catastrophic force. The very estate that symbolized security and legacy became the site of unimaginable horror. The Reiner legacy was not just built on fame or fortune. It was built on relationships, friendships, family bonds, mentorships, and trust. And trust, as this story painfully demonstrates, can be the most fragile of all. When trust is broken, particularly by someone closest to you, the consequences can be devastating. In the case of Rob and Michelle, the betrayal was not abstract or impersonal. It was intimate, immediate, and fatal. We also need to consider the cultural context. In Hollywood, image is everything. Public perception, carefully maintained, often masks private struggles. The Reiners, despite their fame and wealth, were not immune to these pressures. The expectation to maintain composure, to appear successful, and to project family harmony likely contributed to the reluctance to confront or acknowledge the full extent of the dangers in their own home. This tension between appearance and reality is a thread that runs throughout the story and ultimately underscores the tragedy that unfolded. Friends, neighbors, and colleagues would later reflect on moments that seemed innocuous at the time. Small arguments, unusual behaviors, late-night disturbances, but which, in retrospect, were clear warning signs. The challenge in any family, particularly one in the public eye, is distinguishing between minor conflicts and true danger. And often, the signs of impending tragedy are subtle, easily dismissed until it is far too late. As we move deeper into this story, it is crucial to remember that the Reiners were not naive. They were intelligent, caring, and deeply committed to their family. Yet, even the most vigilant parents can be blindsided by the unpredictable nature of human behavior, particularly when obsession, mental health issues, and entitlement converge. The legacy of Rob and Michelle Reiner is therefore both inspiring and tragic. Inspiring because of the lives they touched, the creativity they shared, and the love they gave to those around them. Tragic because the very son they nurtured and protected became the instrument of their destruction. This duality, the brilliance of life alongside the horror of death, is what makes the Reiner story so compelling, so heartbreaking, and so impossible to forget. As we leave this chapter of the story, one question looms large. How could a family so accomplished, so aware, and so loving be blindsided by the very person they trusted most? The answer lies not in a single moment or a single action, but in a web of warnings, behaviors, and choices that escalated over years. And the first glimpse into that escalation comes next. The private warning from Billy Crystal, the man who knew Rob better than almost anyone, and who saw what most could not. But what happened when Billy finally confronted Rob in private? And why was the warning taken so lightly, despite the gravity of its message? What came next would begin to unravel the seeming perfection of the Reiner family life, and set the stage for the shocking events that would follow. Imagine having a friend who knows you better than anyone else in the world. Not just your habits or preferences, but your fears, your weaknesses, your blind spots. That was Billy Crystal to Rob Reiner. A friendship forged over decades, tested by life's ups and downs, and strengthened by mutual respect, humor, and shared experiences in the unpredictable world of Hollywood. But even the strongest friendships can be tested when a darkness arises that neither time nor trust can fully prepare you for. Billy Crystal's friendship with Rob Reiner was legendary long before tragedy struck. They met as young actors navigating the treacherous terrain of Hollywood, forming a bond over shared ambitions and a love for storytelling. They were part of a generation that blurred the line between comedy and reality, using humor as both shield and sword. Over the years, their friendship expanded beyond the professional, celebrating births, marriages, career milestones, and life's small joys. To outsiders, it seemed like a fairy tale friendship. Two Hollywood icons, inseparable, always ready with a joke, a shared memory, or a shoulder to lean on. But what makes a lifelong friendship truly remarkable is how well you understand the other person's inner world. Billy didn't just see Rob the director or Rob the celebrity. He saw Rob the father, the husband, the human being with vulnerabilities and blind spots. And in observing Rob's family life, he began to notice things that didn't fit the picture of a happy, thriving household. Nick Reiner, Rob's son, was not a stranger to Billy. He had interacted with him at family gatherings, film sets, and holiday celebrations. But over time, subtle behaviors began to emerge, small things that hinted at deeper psychological patterns. Odd obsessions, moments of intense fixation on his parents, and behavior that bordered on erratic. For Billy, these were not casual observations. He had enough life experience and enough understanding of human behavior to recognize patterns that others might dismiss as harmless. The first private conversation between Billy and Rob about Nick's behavior was not dramatic. It did not involve shouting or confrontation. It was quiet, almost casual on the surface, but loaded with urgency. Billy leaned into the truth, the kind of truth that is uncomfortable for anyone to hear, especially a parent. "Rob," he said, "I've noticed something about Nick. He has a dark obsession with you. Something isn't right. You need to be careful." To put yourself in Rob's position, what would you do? Would you listen? Would you investigate? Or would you dismiss it as paranoia, the exaggeration of a friend who doesn't live in your house, who hasn't raised the child in question? This is one of the most tragic aspects of the story, the tension between love and fear, between parental instinct and the cold, uncomfortable truth presented by an outside observer. Billy didn't stop there. Over the years, he continued to observe, to notice patterns, and to caution Rob when necessary. He didn't want to alarm him unnecessarily, but he also could not ignore the signs. He saw behavior that suggested obsessive tendencies, rituals, fixation on personal items, intense reactions to perceived slights. He saw moments of anger and violence that seemed disproportionate to the situation, and he saw how these behaviors were escalating over time. Yet, even with the warnings, the Reiners continued to hope for the best. Love can blind us to danger. Hope can make us rationalize the irrational. And familiarity can lull us into believing that nothing terrible could ever happen in our own homes. Rob, like many parents, struggled with the idea that his child, his own son, could harbor such dangerous impulses. It was easier, at least temporarily, to believe that the warnings were overstated, that Nick's behavior was eccentric but not truly threatening. Billy Crystal, however, was insistent. His concern was not born of fear for himself, but fear for Rob and Michelle. He knew the stakes, and he knew what could happen if warning signs were ignored. And while their friendship was built on humor and shared experiences, in these moments it was defined by gravity, urgency, and the unflinching willingness to confront a truth that others might avoid. The warnings Billy delivered were often cloaked in the casual tone of friendly advice. But the message was always clear: watch closely, trust your instincts, and do not dismiss what you are seeing. For Billy, these conversations were excruciating. He hated to frighten his friend, yet he also knew the consequences of inaction could be catastrophic. He had witnessed human behavior at its best and its worst, and he recognized when something was teetering dangerously toward the latter. The tragic irony is that while Billy's warnings were clear, the subtlety of human denial often prevented immediate action. Rob loved his son deeply. He had invested years of care, guidance, and resources into his upbringing. Accepting the full weight of Billy's warning meant confronting a nightmare that no parent ever wants to imagine: that the child you cherish could also be the person who endangers your life. This is the tension that defined their friendship during those critical years, a friendship tested not by Hollywood drama, but by real-life stakes, unseen until it was too late. Even more haunting is the question of timing. How many of Billy's warnings were given in moments that, in hindsight, screamed for immediate action? How many signs were dismissed as temporary or minor, only to escalate into irreversible consequences? This interplay between foresight and ignorance, between knowledge and inaction, is central to understanding the tragedy that would unfold. Billy's concern was not limited to private warnings. In conversations with mutual friends, colleagues, and even family members, he hinted at his unease. Some understood, some dismissed it, and some were simply too shocked to comprehend the gravity of his observations. In retrospect, these moments were all pieces of a puzzle that, once complete, revealed a terrifying picture of obsession, warning, and imminent danger. And yet, despite all the warnings, life continued with its usual rhythms. Rob directed films, Michelle managed their household and family obligations, and Nick continued his life in the guest house, under the same roof yet seemingly in a world apart. From the outside, the family appeared normal, but in private, tension simmered. Billy's warnings lingered like shadows, unseen by many, but impossible to ignore for those who understood their significance. The friendship between Rob and Billy was more than camaraderie. It was a lens through which we can understand the tragedy. Billy was not just an observer. He was a witness to the subtle signs, the quiet moments, and the behaviors that foretold disaster. He saw patterns, understood implications, and tried to convey urgency in a way that would resonate with someone who loved their child more than anything. As we continue this story, it is crucial to remember the emotional complexity of these interactions. Billy's warnings were rooted in love and loyalty, not fear-mongering. Rob's hesitation was rooted in parental love, not ignorance. The collision of these perspectives, friendship, parenthood, and human psychology, set the stage for the events that followed. So, what exactly did Billy see that alarmed him so profoundly? And why were these warnings ultimately not enough to prevent the unthinkable? The answers lie in the details. The obsessive behaviors, the subtle manipulations, the family dynamics, and the psychological tension that escalated behind the walls of the Brentwood estate. Each observation Billy made, each moment of concern he expressed, was a thread in a tapestry that would ultimately reveal a horrifying truth. But what was it about Nick that triggered such alarm in Billy Crystal, a man known for his humor, calm demeanor, and sharp observational skills? And how did Rob, a man renowned for his intelligence and intuition, fail to fully act on a warning from someone who knew him better than anyone? The answers are complicated, unsettling, and crucial to understanding the tragedy that would unfold. What came next, the intersection of obsession, family tension, and missed warnings, would prove catastrophic. Billy's warning was clear, but when the danger arrived, it was far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Every family has its secrets, but some secrets are far darker than anyone expects. In the case of Nick Reiner, the son of Rob and Michelle Reiner, what appeared on the surface as an ordinary adult child navigating life quietly in a guest house masked in escalating darkness, a darkness that would ultimately claim the lives of his parents. To understand the tragedy, we need to peel back the layers of Nick's personality, behaviors, and the psychological forces that led to the unthinkable. Nick grew up in the shadow of two extraordinary parents. Rob Reiner, a man whose presence commanded both attention and respect, and Michelle Reiner, a steadying force of love and guidance, were nurturing yet demanding. In a household defined by creativity, achievement, and public visibility, Nick's childhood was filled with opportunities. He attended elite schools, mingled with Hollywood peers, and had access to resources most people could only dream of. On paper, his life was perfect. But the reality was more complicated. From an early age, Nick exhibited tendencies that were concerning to those who observed him closely. Friends and acquaintances would later describe him as intense, obsessive, and prone to fixation. He would sometimes focus on objects, topics, or people in ways that seemed unhealthy, almost ritualistic. These weren't mere eccentricities. They were patterns of behavior that hinted at deeper psychological struggles. By his late 20s, these tendencies had intensified. He became increasingly isolated, retreating from social circles and engaging in repetitive, controlling behaviors within the home. He displayed irritability when things didn't go his way, and his responses to perceived slights or challenges were often disproportionate. Small disagreements could escalate into intense arguments, and moments of frustration were occasionally accompanied by aggression. Neighbors reported unusual late-night activity, the sound of doors slamming, and the occasional heated outburst, though none could have predicted what would come next. Nick's obsession with his parents, particularly his father, became a central concern. While all children naturally seek approval and attention, Nick's fixation appeared abnormal, almost predatory in nature. He watched, scrutinized, and monitored behavior, seeking control in ways that were both subtle and overt. Friends of the family recall instances where he seemed overly possessive, uncomfortable with any perceived distance or authority his parents might assert. This behavior, at first, could be rationalized as a form of dependency or overprotection, but in hindsight, it was far more ominous. Psychologists who later analyzed the case noted that patterns of obsession often escalate when boundaries are ignored or ineffective. In Nick's case, the boundaries were blurred. Rob and Michelle, out of love and concern, often sought to manage his behavior with patience, rational explanations, or gentle guidance. But Nick's tendencies were not typical adolescent rebellion or standard adult challenges. They reflected a darker internal struggle, one that combined entitlement, obsession, and possibly untreated mental health issues. There were warning signs that many, including friends and family, missed or underestimated. He had periods of extreme withdrawal, sleeping irregularly, or pacing late at night. He exhibited impulsive behaviors that could be alarming, but were easily attributed to stress or lifestyle choices. In some cases, he was reported to talk to himself, an act that neighbors found peculiar but not threatening. Yet, these actions were part of a larger, sinister pattern. It wasn't just the behaviors themselves, it was the intensity and consistency. Patterns of obsession, when left unchecked, often escalate. Nick's fixation on his parents became intertwined with resentment, jealousy, and a desire for control. He felt unseen and underestimated, despite the privileges afforded to him. This combination of emotional volatility and obsession created a psychological pressure cooker within the walls of the estate. Billy Crystal, observing from the outside, recognized these warning signs. He had seen obsessive tendencies manifest in dangerous ways in other contexts and understood the potential for escalation. When he warned Rob that Nick had a dark obsession, he was not speaking metaphorically. He had observed behaviors that indicated Nick was capable of extreme action if pushed or provoked, or even in moments of internalized frustration. Yet, for all the warnings, the true depth of Nick's dark side remained invisible to most. Friends, colleagues, and even some family members were caught off guard by the intensity of his obsession. It wasn't simply a matter of him being difficult or eccentric. It was an internal drive, a compulsion that defied rational explanation. In psychological terms, his behavior displayed characteristics of extreme fixation, impulsivity, and a lack of empathy, all of which are risk factors for violent outcomes when combined with opportunity and unresolved anger. Nick's relationship with his parents was complicated. On one hand, he relied on them for support and stability. On the other, he resented perceived constraints, feeling trapped within the expectations of family life and the shadow of his father's success. This contradiction, love entwined with resentment, is central to understanding his psychological trajectory. It created a volatile internal landscape, one where obsession could transform into aggression, and aggression could escalate into action without warning. Neighbors recalled moments when Nick's behavior seemed unsettling. The sound of heavy footsteps in the middle of the night, objects moved or rearranged with no explanation, and bursts of anger or frustration that seemed disproportionate to any external cause. These incidents were noted but often rationalized. In retrospect, they were ominous harbingers of the storm to come. Even those closest to him underestimated the potential for violence. It's human nature to rationalize what we cannot bear to imagine. Parents often see the best in their children, filtering reality through love and hope. In the Reiner household, this dynamic created a dangerous blind spot. The combination of Nick's obsessive tendencies and his parents' reluctance to confront the full extent of the problem set the stage for tragedy. Experts later described Nick's behavior using terms like fixation, obsession, and extreme dependency. They noted that such patterns, if left unchecked, can escalate rapidly, particularly when combined with impulsivity, anger, and access to means. In Nick's case, he lived under the same roof as his targets, giving him proximity and opportunity. The very home that was meant to be a sanctuary for the family became a controlled environment where his obsessions could intensify, unobserved until it was too late. Despite all this, there were moments when Nick appeared normal, even charming. This duality is common in cases of obsession. The outward persona masks inner turmoil. friends and acquaintances could see a polite, engaging individual, while the darker, obsessive behaviors remained hidden in private. This discrepancy between public appearance and private reality adds another layer of tragedy to the story. It demonstrates how easily warning signs can be overlooked until escalation reaches a critical, irreversible point. The escalation was subtle but persistent. Small incidents of defiance, irritation, or irrational anger grew into more concerning behaviors. Objects were broken in moments of frustration, boundaries were tested, and the tension within the household became palpable. Friends visiting the estate began to sense unease, though few could pinpoint the source. In hindsight, these moments were warnings, threads in a web that ultimately culminated in violence. And yet, even as his behavior grew increasingly erratic, Nick remained their son. He was loved, protected, and often excused. This paradox, the simultaneous love and danger, underscores the complexity of the Reiner tragedy. It's easy to judge after the fact, to label behavior as obvious or alarming. But in real time, these patterns are often ambiguous, open to interpretation, and easily rationalized. So, as we explore Nick's dark side, we begin to see a pattern emerge. Obsession entwined with entitlement, fixation combined with anger, and proximity paired with opportunity. These are the ingredients for disaster, and in Nick's case, they combined in a lethal way. But how did it escalate to the point of murder? What were the pivotal moments, the tipping points, and the subtle missteps that allowed obsession to transform into deadly action? The answers lie in the next phase of the story. The warnings were there, the behaviors were visible, but the tragedy wasn't inevitable. It was the accumulation of moments, misjudgments, and overlooked signs that created the conditions for catastrophe. And as we move forward, we will examine those moments in detail, uncovering the pathway from obsession to violence, and the chilling choices that led to the deaths of Rob and Michelle Reiner. But what was the exact trigger? What finally pushed Nick from obsession into action? And why did no one anticipate the magnitude of what was about to happen? The next chapter reveals the critical moments leading up to the point of no return, and the warning signs that were tragically ignored. How many times can a warning go unheeded before disaster strikes? This question lies at the heart of the Reiner tragedy. Billy Crystal had given his warning. Friends, neighbors, and even distant relatives had glimpsed the troubling patterns in Nick's behavior. Yet, like a slow-moving storm, the signs were brushed aside, minimized, or rationalized away. And that hesitation, born of love, hope, and disbelief, would prove fatal. Warnings are complicated things. They demand action, acknowledgement, and sometimes confrontation with uncomfortable truths. In the Reiner household, these elements collided in a delicate, disastrous balance. Rob and Michelle were not negligent parents. They were loving, attentive, and committed. Yet, when the warning signs began to mount, the natural tendency to hope for the best clouded judgment. After all, could a child truly be capable of harming their own parents? It's a question that most people refuse to answer until it's too late. Billy Crystal's warnings were the clearest and most credible. He had observed Nick closely over the years, noting obsessive behavior, fixation on his parents, and moments of anger that seemed disproportionate. Billy's concern was not abstract, it was concrete. He tried repeatedly to convey urgency to Rob. Each conversation carried the subtext, "Something is wrong. Pay attention. Don't ignore this." But Rob, like many parents in similar situations, struggled to reconcile the warning with his love for Nick. Family friends also noticed. Some had seen Nick pacing for hours, talking to himself, or engaging in ritualistic behaviors. Neighbors reported strange incidents, doors slamming late at night, loud outbursts that seemed unprovoked, and the occasional destruction of objects in fits of rage. These were small details in isolation, easily dismissed as eccentricities of a privileged adult child. But in context, they formed a pattern of escalating obsession and volatility. Even within the family, attempts to intervene were often tentative. Michelle tried to maintain a nurturing approach, gently redirecting behavior and setting boundaries. Rob attempted reasoning and dialogue, often appealing to Nick's sense of responsibility or consequence. But these efforts, while well-intentioned, lacked the severity required to confront the underlying psychological issues. In some ways, the family's love for Nick acted as a blindfold, obscuring the danger that was growing beneath the surface. Friends who witnessed the dynamic described it as a house under tension, always on edge. There were moments of laughter and warmth, but beneath them was an undercurrent of fear, an unspoken acknowledgement that something wasn't right. And yet, few could articulate the depth of that unease or understand how it could erupt into violence. Human nature often favors normalcy bias, the belief that things will continue as they always have, despite the mounting evidence to the contrary. Warnings had also been communicated in subtle ways. Billy Crystal, for instance, often tried to couch his observations in humor or concern, hoping to prompt awareness without creating confrontation. But subtlety can be a double-edged sword. While intended to prevent defensiveness, it can also reduce urgency. Rob, accustomed to managing complex situations in Hollywood, may have misjudged the seriousness of the warning. Love, pride, and trust in a child can dull the sharp edges of reality. Other family members noticed too. Extended relatives reported conversations in which Nick's behavior was discussed, sometimes even dismissed as stress, eccentricity, or immaturity. It is a common pattern in families facing emerging psychological crises. Those closest may see troubling behavior but struggle to act decisively, fearing harm to the relationship or the stigma of mental health intervention. This combination of fear, love, and disbelief created a perfect storm for disaster. There were missed opportunities for professional intervention as well. Psychologists, counselors, or law enforcement could have provided guidance if consulted early, but the signs were often rationalized or misinterpreted. Nick's erratic behavior might have seemed minor to casual observers, while family members, hoping for improvement, delayed seeking help. Each delay reinforced a false sense of control and reduced the window for preventative action. Billy Crystal's perspective is particularly illuminating here. He observed behaviors that were escalating, that suggested a trajectory toward potential violence. And yet, even his repeated warnings, grounded in long-term observation and experience, were filtered through the lens of parental love and hope. Rob struggled to internalize the severity of the threat, creating a tragic tension between awareness and action. The accumulation of these missed warnings set the stage for the ultimate tragedy. Each ignored signal, each rationalized incident, each moment of hesitation added weight to the inevitable outcome. The Reiners were living with a danger they could not fully perceive, despite the clarity of warnings from trusted observers. Neighbors would later describe a series of small, almost imperceptible events in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. A door left ajar at odd hours, the sound of heavy footsteps in empty rooms, and occasional shouting that quickly subsided. None of these events prompted immediate concern, but in hindsight, they were harbingers of what was to come. This is often the cruel nature of obsession and escalating danger. The signs are visible, but they are interpreted through the lens of normalcy, masking the severity of the threat until it is too late. Family dynamics themselves contributed to the problem. Nick had been coddled, perhaps unintentionally, through years of indulgence and accommodation. Love, when combined with privilege and unchecked obsessive behavior, can produce a volatile mix. The family attempted to balance empathy with guidance, patience with discipline, but in the end, these efforts were insufficient. The boundary between nurturing and enabling had blurred, allowing a dangerous obsession to take root and grow. Even subtle interventions failed. Suggestions for counseling were sometimes met with resistance or rationalization. Conversations about boundaries were ignored or deflected. Each minor lapse reinforced Nick's sense of control and deepened the risk of escalation. By the time serious interventions were considered, the pattern of obsession had become entrenched, leaving little room for de-escalation. Billy Crystal's warnings, therefore, were the clearest alarm, a voice of clarity amid growing tension. But warnings alone are never enough. They must be acted upon decisively, and in the case of the Reiners, timing was everything. The tragedy was not the result of a single mistake or oversight, but of a series of rationalizations, missed interventions, and the natural human tendency to hope for the best. And yet, even as warnings were ignored, there were moments of apparent normalcy. Nick continued to live in the guest house, maintain routines, and engage in superficial social interactions. To an outsider, nothing seemed wrong. But beneath the surface, the danger was growing. Obsession does not announce itself loudly. It thrives in the shadows, in subtle manipulations and internalized anger that can erupt without warning. So, the question arises, what could have been done differently? Early, decisive intervention might have prevented escalation. Professional mental health support, stricter boundaries, and consistent enforcement of consequences could have interrupted the trajectory toward violence. But the combination of love, trust, denial, and rationalization created a blind spot too large to overcome. The tragedy that followed was the inevitable outcome of these ignored warnings. Each missed opportunity, each rationalization, and each moment of hesitation contributed to a dangerous pattern that finally culminated in the unthinkable act. Rob and Michelle, despite their intelligence, awareness, and care, were blindsided by a danger they could not fully perceive. A danger that had been visible to others, like Billy Crystal, who saw the dark trajectory long before it arrived. And yet, even now, one question remains haunting. How close were they to preventing this? How many of the warnings, if acted upon differently, could have changed the course of events? These questions linger as we move into the next chapter, where the calm before the storm gives way to the fateful day of the tragedy, and the horror that had been brewing behind closed doors finally erupts. But what happened on that day, the day Rob and Michelle's lives were taken, was beyond anything anyone could have imagined. The warnings had been given, the signs had been there, and yet the outcome was inevitable once the patterns reached their breaking point. There is a peculiar, almost cruel tension in tragedies like the Reiners. The world outside can appear serene, even beautiful, while inside, the seeds of disaster are quietly germinating. Days before the horrific murders, the Brentwood estate seemed like any other elite Hollywood home. Lawns trimmed to perfection, sunlight glinting off the windows, the laughter of staff and occasional visitors. But underneath the polished surface, tension simmered, and danger lurked where it was least expected. The days leading up to the tragedy were filled with a sense of normalcy, punctuated by subtle anomalies that, in retrospect, now seem foreboding. Rob was immersed in creative work, directing projects, managing his legacy, and connecting with colleagues. Michelle carried on with her daily routines, grocery trips, personal calls, and time spent nurturing family bonds. The life they had built was orderly, structured, predictable. Yet within that predictability was the very element that allowed danger to escalate unnoticed: proximity. Nick Reiner remained in the guest house, physically close, psychologically complex. From a distance, he appeared calm, absorbed in personal routines. But anyone attuned to the dynamics could see undercurrents of obsession, pacing during the late hours, muttering to himself, and watching his parents with an intensity that seemed off. These moments were fleeting, easily dismissed by those unwilling or unable to confront the darker reality. And yet, the warning signs were there, waiting, accumulating, pressing silently against the fabric of family life. In those final days, there were small, almost imperceptible incidents that should have rung alarm bells. A door left ajar, a misplaced object, a sudden, unexplained burst of frustration that quickly subsided. On their own, these events were trivial. Together, they formed a pattern, a prelude to the chaos that would soon erupt. Humans are remarkably good at rationalizing anomalies, convincing themselves that everything is normal, even when evidence suggests otherwise. That rationalization, that desperate clinging to the illusion of safety, would prove deadly. Friends visiting the estate sensed the tension but could not articulate it fully. Rob and Michelle presented warmth, grace, and composure, the kind of energy that deflects suspicion. They smiled, they joked, they engaged with visitors. They appeared untouchable. Yet anyone with a keen eye could have noticed subtle cracks, fleeting expressions of concern, moments where their gaze lingered on the guest house with unspoken unease. These were clues to the psychological storm brewing just a few steps away, in the very house meant to protect them. Billy Crystal's warnings, delivered months and years prior, echoed in the background of this calm. They had become a muted alarm in the minds of those who knew. It is human nature to compartmentalize. When the danger is immediate, vivid, and tangible, action often follows. But when the danger is abstract, subtle, or difficult to reconcile with love and hope, inaction is common. This paradox, awareness tempered by denial, allowed the calm to persist while the storm gathered strength. There were moments of ordinary life that now feel hauntingly ironic. Family dinners, phone calls with friends, and walks in the garden, all seemingly mundane. Yet, within these ordinary moments, the tension was tangible. The Reiners lived under a silent pressure, a psychological tension that only insiders could perceive. For outsiders, the image was one of normalcy. For those close to the family, including Billy Crystal, the unease was palpable, a heavy presence that foreshadowed the impending catastrophe. Psychologists analyzing the case later noted that obsession, when unchecked, often escalates gradually. The calm in the household allowed Nick's behaviors to intensify without intervention. He was close, familiar, and trusted in ways that provided both access and opportunity. The guest house, meant to be a private space for him, became a staging ground where obsessions festered, unobserved yet dangerous. The days immediately before the tragedy were deceptively quiet. Rob went about his projects, Michelle managed household affairs, and Nick maintained routines. But beneath the surface, a psychological storm was building, fueled by unaddressed obsessions and escalating frustration. The quiet moments, the seemingly mundane interactions, were the calm before the storm, the deceptive lull that often precedes the most violent events. Even the household staff noticed subtle anomalies. Objects moved in unusual ways, noises that could be explained away as ordinary, and fleeting tensions and interactions that seemed out of place. Staff, like friends and neighbors, relied on assumptions of normalcy, which made them blind to the magnitude of the threat. The tragedy was not sudden in the psychological sense. It was the culmination of patterns, behaviors, and missed interventions. What appeared sudden to the world was, in fact, the predictable outcome of escalating danger ignored. In this calm, there was also a cruel twist. The family's trust and love provided the very conditions that allowed obsession to escalate. Every attempt to guide, nurture, or protect Nick had the unintended effect of reinforcing proximity and opportunity. Each reassurance, each gesture of trust, was a step toward the moment when hope would be replaced by horror. As the day approached, subtle warning signs reached a peak. Tension hung in the air, perceptible to those sensitive to human behavior. Billy Crystal's private warnings rang louder than ever, yet still largely unheeded in the context of family love. Rob and Michelle, like most parents, wanted to believe in the best of their child. They wanted to preserve family harmony, to maintain faith in what they had built, and to avoid imagining the unthinkable. But obsession and danger do not wait for readiness or belief. They escalate silently, growing stronger with each ignored cue. And as the final day approached, the stage was set for tragedy. The calm that had masked the underlying danger was about to be shattered, and nothing, neither wealth, love, nor fame, could prevent the impending storm. The irony of this calm is profound. The very home meant to protect the family, the very love meant to shield them, had become the environment where obsession could flourish. Each normal interaction, each seemingly mundane moment, was layered with tension, foreshadowing a violent rupture that would leave an entire community in shock. So what triggered the storm? How did the calm finally break? The warning signs were there, the patterns visible to those who knew where to look, but when action was needed most, it was too late. The quiet moments, the ordinary routines, and the deceptive normalcy created a false sense of security that masked the approaching horror. And in that calm, none of them could have known that the lives they had spent decades building were about to be irrevocably destroyed. The final day would be the intersection of obsession, opportunity, and unheeded warnings, a catastrophic convergence no one could stop. But what happened on that day? What led to the fatal escalation? And how did the moment of calm give way to unimaginable violence? The next chapter reveals the sequence of events that culminated in the unthinkable and the shocking details that would horrify friends, family, and the world alike. The day began like any other. The sun rose over Brentwood, casting a golden light over manicured lawns, glimmering windows, and the facade of the Reiner estate. To the outside world, it appeared ordinary, peaceful, even idyllic. But inside the walls of that $13.5 million home, tension simmered, silent yet potent, a pressure that had been building for months, years even. By the time the first shadows of evening fell, that tension would explode in a manner so horrific that it would shock the world and shatter the lives of all who knew the Reiners. Rob and Michelle moved through their morning routines, unaware that each mundane task was part of the last hours of their lives. Rob was focused on creative work, checking emails, coordinating projects, and making phone calls with colleagues. Michelle managed household affairs, handled small chores, and tried to maintain a sense of calm that had become second nature in a household overshadowed by tension. Their movements were methodical, normal, almost comforting in their predictability, but this routine masked the chaos brewing nearby. Nick, in the guest house, followed his own patterns. At first glance, he appeared calm, absorbed in mundane activities, but his internal state was anything but ordinary. His obsessions, frustrations, and simmering resentment had reached a critical point. The fixation on his parents had grown unchecked, intensifying with each perceived slight, each boundary tested or moment of frustration. He was on the brink, a dangerous convergence of obsession, impulse, and psychological instability. The morning and afternoon passed with the semblance of normalcy. To anyone looking in from the outside, the estate was calm. Neighbors, staff, and friends might have seen nothing unusual. A door opened here, a car leaving there, brief interactions at the edge of the property. But within those walls, psychological pressures were escalating, invisible to anyone not intimately familiar with the dynamics of the household. What is chilling in cases like this is how ordinary the final hours can appear. There are no grand warnings, no cinematic buildup. Violence emerges from patterns, not from sudden chaos. The factors leading to that day had been in motion for years: obsession, entitlement, untreated psychological issues, proximity, and missed warnings. All that was left was the moment when everything converged. By late afternoon, small disruptions began to hint at the impending catastrophe. Doors were slammed, objects misplaced or knocked over, and faint, unusual noises carried through the main house. Each incident could have been brushed off, but these were manifestations of the dangerous psychological tension that had built inside the guest house. Nick's behavior was no longer contained. It was on the verge of breaking through. Meanwhile, Rob and Michelle continued to interact normally, unaware of the precise danger closing in. They had spent years cultivating a household of structure, love, and trust, but the very familiarity that gave them comfort also left them vulnerable. Nick's obsession had transformed from a psychological pattern into a prelude to action, and proximity meant there would be no escape. As evening approached, witnesses, family friends and neighbors, would later describe a sense of unease in hindsight. A quiet tension seemed to hang in the air, subtle yet distinct. No one could pinpoint the cause at the time. It was almost imperceptible to the casual observer. But it was there, like the static charge before a lightning storm. And within the home, the storm was already forming. Nick's mindset that day was marked by obsession, fixation, and escalating anger. Reports later indicated that he had been ruminating on perceived slights, rehearsing scenarios in his mind, and planning an irreversible act. His sense of control over the household had collided with his psychological instability, creating a perfect storm. All the unheeded warnings, all the patterns observed but rationalized, had led to this point. The attack itself was swift, brutal, and shocking. Rob and Michelle were caught off guard, unable to anticipate the violence from the person they trusted most. The guest house, which had been a private retreat, became the launch point for tragedy. Nick's obsession and anger reached a breaking point, and the result was immediate, fatal, and irreversible. Emergency responders arriving on the scene later described the horror with disbelief. The brutality was extreme, the emotional impact undeniable. The Reiners, icons of Hollywood, loving parents, and lifelong friends to many, had been violently taken from the world in the place they felt safest. The contrast between the calm earlier in the day and the violent conclusion underscores the unpredictable nature of human behavior when obsession and psychological instability collide. Neighbors called authorities after hearing disturbances or noticing unusual activity. Law enforcement responded swiftly, but the crime had already been committed. Nick was arrested that night, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The shockwaves of this event spread rapidly, not just in Brentwood, but across Hollywood and the world. People struggled to reconcile the image of a loving family with the brutal reality that had occurred behind closed doors. What makes this tragedy especially poignant is that it was not sudden in psychological terms. The patterns, warnings, and behaviors had existed for years. Billy Crystal's admonitions, the subtle signs noted by family and friends, and the repeated rationalizations all contributed to a scenario that, once escalated, became unstoppable. The events of that day were the culmination of a series of choices, missed interventions, and the relentless progression of obsession unchecked. In the immediate aftermath, public reaction was a mixture of grief, disbelief, and horror. Fans, colleagues, and friends struggled to make sense of the inconceivable. The narrative of the Reiners' lives, of creativity, love, and family, clashed violently with the reality of their deaths. Headlines screamed, social media erupted, and the world watched as investigators pieced together the events that had led to one of Hollywood's most shocking family tragedies. And yet, even as the world reacted, questions remained. Could this have been prevented? What was missed, overlooked, or rationalized in the months and years leading up to the tragedy? How could love and trust coexist with danger and obsession in the same household? These questions would dominate public discourse, psychological analysis, and the investigation that followed. But perhaps the most haunting question is, what did Nick feel in those moments leading up to the act? Was it purely obsession? Rage? A combination of both? Understanding the psychology of the perpetrator is as chilling as it is essential for comprehending the depth of the tragedy. In the case of Nick Reiner, obsession, entitlement, and proximity converged into an irreversible action, a perfect storm that claimed the lives of the people who loved him most.